Somebody else knows they're doing. Because in 1968, we protested Shell Oil, Asia then, Asia. Howard University. Shell Oil. Because they were exporting not just that, they were exporting.
Right outside the city.
Oh, yes, all up and down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
you didn't, then raise your hand, and the Reverend Dr. Shafe will. Good afternoon. I'm always curious to see which side of the boat leans which way on a Sunday. It's usually this side, but that's okay. I'll get used to looking this way. Welcome to Newell Presbyterian Church, whether you are here in person in the pews or you are joining over the live stream or watching later. We are so glad that you're here for what I hope will be the first of multiple courageous and timely conversations. And today we are doing worship and work, how the church can move toward ending poverty and racism. And we've got a number of really amazing people that are going to help lead this time together, but that also includes all of y'all. And so when we get to the panel side, you should have a little blank piece of paper and a pencil, and we're going to ask folks to actually write questions because we only have 2 of these mics, and we're going to let the panelists pass the 2 between them instead of trying to run one around. So if you'll write your question down, and then the Reverend Dr. Allison Schaaf is going to collect those for us so that we can relay them to folks when we get to that point. Also, y'all are not allowed to tell my congregation that we started on the dot at 12:15 today, because worship is at 11. It's 11:04 every Sunday. And so we are grateful that you're here. But to kick us off, to offer an opening prayer, this event is a co-sponsored event from Columbia Theological Seminary and the Presbytery of Charlotte's anti-racism cohort. And so one from our Presbytery cohort who I would imagine most of you know at least a little bit by now. But Doris Boyd is going to open us with prayer. And so, Miss Doris, if you want to come on up here. And then I'll introduce William.
Good morning, saints. Let us go to God in prayer. Center yourselves for a second or two. Gracious Father, first and foremost, before we petition you this morning, we want to thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving us the health, the strength, and even the resources to come together today. Help us to stay focused on the agenda. We know what the agenda is going to be. Help us to be reminded that we can't fix everything, but all of us collectively can do something. Help us also to realize racism and poverty may not ever go away completely. But if all of us focus our attention on doing something, sometimes, Heavenly Father, it's just changing the attitude, starting with changing your attitude about it. It's also can be about understanding the history, understanding how we got to this point, but never really accepting it. Help us to be open today for the questions and the answers. Help us to continue to show kindness, love, and generosity, even when we leave these four walls. And at the end of the day, dear God, let us all see that we've made a difference in changing this world and sharing the humanity that you placed in our hearts, and it got lost somewhere. Help us to restore everything that we lost or that was taken from us, and put this kingdom back like you intended for it to be. I give you this petition, Lord God, from my heart. Amen.
So when it comes to introductions, both for the Reverend Dr. William Yu and all of the other panelists, you can read their bios in the handout. And so I'm not going to focus on those. I'm going to do the fun stuff that's not printed there. So William Yu started at Columbia Theological Seminary at about the same time as me. I think I was actually his first class coming through, and he was my advisor. So present company aside, he's an outstanding professor and helps shepherd students through Columbia with grace and joy and humor. Last night, we got to eat dinner. He was with my family, and he was the chief joke teller. So the knock-knock jokes continued this morning when my boys came downstairs. But he is not only one of the smartest and kindest people I know, he is the second best ping pong player and bowler in this room right now. And so I am excited to turn it over to him, and he's going to offer the lecture side of our Lunch and Learn, and so you are encouraged to continue to eat. If you didn't get food yet, we still have some more back there, but by way of flight attendant duties, bathrooms are that way and this way if you need them, but you guys all gave up some time on your Saturday, so be where you need to be, but we'll turn it over to the Reverend Dr. William Yu.
Well, and I'm happy to be here. I'm grateful to Reverend Matt Connor. That's right, and it was September of 2014 when Matt was a fresh college graduate, right, coming to Columbia Seminary. He had his freshly minted bachelor's degree from UNC Chapel Hill. I had my freshly minted doctorate from Emory University, and we were both just young, scrappy, and hungry, trying to make our way through seminary. Matt getting his MDiv, and me just wanting to teach and learn, and it was a joy. It was a joy to teach Matt in the classroom, really blessed and impressed with his intellect, but also his heart for ministry, his heart for people, all that he was doing in and around Decatur when he was a student, with prison ministry, with ministry in congregations, and ministry on campus. And yes, as Matt shared, we also did have a lot of fun together. We played ping pong at the seminary. We had a table there. Honestly, though, Matt, I don't think you beat me one time, the times that we've played. I will say we were both good, but we had a growing, and now a lot more, we had a growing international student population with students from Asia and Africa. And I will say the students from Asia, because me and Matt are both domestic with our blue U.S. passports, they beat both of us real good. So I always said I'm the best U.S. playing ping pong player at Columbia Seminary. And we also bowled together, played basketball together, football and the like. So it's great, and it's great to reconnect with Matt. It was great to be here at Newell Presbyterian, the church that Matt pastors and leads. And I'm grateful to be here with all of you for this difficult, challenging, urgent, necessary, and I hope with honesty and hopefulness that we can talk and tackle this together. That what we do and talk about here, we can continue to enact out there. So I'm going to start, next slide please, with a little bit about one man, and then move to the larger topic of worship and work and how the church can move toward ending poverty and racism. In 1776, Lemuel Haynes, born to a white mother and black father, wrote an essay entitled Liberty Further Extended, or Free Thoughts on the Illegality of Slave Keeping. Haynes was the pastor of small and predominantly white congregations in Connecticut, Vermont, and New York for more than 40 years. From roughly 1789 to 1833. Haynes was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1753, but little is known of his parents. Historians believe his father was either enslaved or a free black man working as a waiter in a hotel. One possibility for Haynes' mother is Alice Fitch, an indentured servant of Scottish descent who worked for a man named John Haynes. Lemuel Haynes was given over as a ward of the state of Connecticut as an infant and lived under the indenture system with a white family. The patriarch of this family, David Rose, was a farmer from a small Connecticut town of Durham, and they relocated, he and his wife Elizabeth Fowler Rose, their children, and Haynes, to Granville, Massachusetts. Formal schooling opportunities in the rural town of Granville were scarce, but Haynes expressed deep appreciation to the Rose family for teaching him, in his words, the principles of religion at their home. And he especially credited Elizabeth Fowler Rose for caring for him as, quote, as though I was her own child, end quote. Haynes assiduously studied the Bible and could recite from memory a good number of biblical texts explaining the doctrine of God's grace. He also memorized the hymns of Isaac Watts and pored over published sermons from popular preachers such as George Whitefield. Haynes completed his indenture at the age of 21 in 1774, and he enlisted in the military to fight for the Continental Army in the American Revolutionary War. Next slide. And Liberty Further Extended, Haynes referenced both the Declaration of Independence and several scriptural passages. Haynes vigorously supported the patriot cause, but he also desired a morally consistent revolution that simultaneously sought American independence from England and black emancipation. Haynes argued that it was important for the Patriots to work toward abolishing slavery as they protested and battled against British and Loyalist forces for the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Haynes concurred and agreed with the Patriots that liberty was a right granted to all people by God. And he wrote that liberty was a jewel which was handed down to man from the cabinet of heaven. Haynes also cited Acts chapter 17, verse 26, and wrote, quote, it hath pleased God to make of one blood all nations of men, to dwell together upon the face of the earth, end quote. Haynes therefore maintained that persons of African descent, such as himself and others, had no less a right to liberty than the white colonists. He acknowledged that there were growing numbers of Christian justifications of slavery. But Haynes dismissed even those of the most cogent kind as essentially deficient and a sad consequence of the imputation of sin after the fall of humankind, a Calvinist doctrine tracing human depravity to the trespasses of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis. English Christians, according to Haynes, deceived themselves and betrayed the gospel in using the glorious truths of the Bible to defend the vile and atrocious injustices of the transatlantic slave trade and, in his words, slave keeping in the North American colonies. Next slide. After the American Revolution, Haynes continued to believe that pastors had the responsibility to preach about social justice. The doctrine of God's sovereignty informed how he could understood pulpit ministry. Because God ruled over all things, Haynes, and he believed other preachers such as himself, sought to illumine how current events revealed both the wondrous love and holy rebuke of Jesus Christ. In an ordination sermon in 1791 for his white colleague in the Congregationalist tradition, Reuben Parmalee, who was becoming the new minister of First Congregational Church in Hinesburg, Vermont, Lemuel Haynes described the pastorate as a watchtower. Every ministry was a spiritual watchman, in Haynes' words, who declared the whole counsel of God. Haynes ardently believed that pastors could not fulfill their duty on the watchtower without engaging politics from the pulpit. In 1813, Haynes preached that it was inappropriate for ministers of the gospel to be, quote, noisy and clamorous in party disputes. Perhaps we might use the language of to be political but not partisan. But Lemuel Haynes also found that it was impossible for pastors to educate congregations on the civic responsibilities of Christians without directly addressing political matters. Haynes cited, for example, Christ's warnings against the oppressive actions of governing rulers in Matthew 23. And he exhorted in one sermon, quote, "Was not our blessed Lord a political preacher when he reproved those in authority?" End quote. One insight from Haynes, as we discern how churches can move toward ending poverty and racism today, is to differentiate between principles, policies, and politicians. Christians, I believe, ought to form and refine clear principles about pressing social issues and injustices through deep study of the Bible and other theological resources alongside mutual discernment in a worshiping community of faith. Rather than asking, is this too political? Which I find that question is raised a lot in congregations. I think Christians should ask, is this spiritual? Is this moral? Is this biblical? Is this just? Is this loving? Is this of Christ? And then interpret policies and politicians according to one's principles or according to a congregation's principles. This move from principles to policies to politicians requires, next slide please, I think reframing what has been known for a long time, and not only Southern Presbyterian churches, but I think a lot of Protestant churches in this country, the spiritual mission of the church. There was this doctrine that was founded in the years before the Civil War, probably roughly the 1840s, 1850s, known as the doctrine of the spirituality of the church. Simply put, this doctrine maintains that the church is most faithful as a strictly spiritual entity, responsible for biblical teaching, worship, administering the sacraments, and offering pastoral care. But this doctrine, seeking to separate Christian ministry from politics or civic participation, was actually born out of a civic and political matter, the ongoing and intensifying national debates over slavery. So at one level, when we think about the chicken and the egg thing with this doctrine of the spirituality of the church, I don't think the doctrine is totally wrong. I do think sometimes when we talk about culture and politics and partisanship, certainly that can be corrosive and divisive in a congregation. There is a difference between a political advocacy caucus or coalition and group and a worshiping community of faith. But at the same time, I do think this doctrine has been harmful in the ways which it has separated the moral and material from the spiritual. I do think this is too narrow and too small an understanding of the spiritual mission of the church. And I do want to, and we can debate all about the virtues and vices of this doctrine, but perhaps as a historian, one point I would like to make is that we all know where this doctrine originated from. that originated from pro-slavery Christianity and the desire from at least some white Southern Presbyterians and other Christians desiring to maintain and sustain the unjust practice of slavery, or at the very least, keeping discussion and debate of that outside of the church, outside of sessions in Presbyterian congregations, presbytery synods, and the General Assembly, for those of us who are Presbyterian. So we have this doctrine that has been long-standing. At the seminary where I teach, one of the originators or authors of this doctrine is one of the professors. His name was James Henley Thornwell. Taught at the University of South Carolina for a bit. Was at in the 1840s, I think at the age of 36 or something like that, young, he was the youngest person to ever be elected moderator of the General Assembly. So I guess he was respected, knew what he was talking about, but he himself was an enslaver, defender of slavery, taught at Columbia, South Carolina at the university, and then in the 1850s left the university to teach at Columbia Seminary. So he was there, and we've got this doctrine. And I think at Columbia Seminary, even after the move from Columbia, South Carolina to Decatur or Atlanta, Georgia, we continue to wrestle with this doctrine. Perhaps the loudest debates of this doctrine came during the Civil Rights Movement era, and thinking about that. So we've been thinking about this doctrine for a long time at Columbia Seminary. And a later professor, next slide please, the Old Testament scholar and theologian Walter Brueggemann, he wrote some about wrestling with spirituality and this doctrine. So here's what he writes in a later book. I think first it was Sabbath as Resistance in the early 2000s, and this came out in 2020, Materiality as Resistance. And the argument, you can see the quote there from this book, is really to separate material and materiality from materialism. Materialism is a sin. To elevate and care more about capital and material and wealth than any other thing. But to note that materiality and the material world are gifts from God, and that God desires for us to care for the earth, to care for one another, to care for what we do with the material goods in this earth. That is a mission from God. And he notes, and he looks at this other historian named Peter Brown, to note that the early church, when it was filled with lots of people on the margins, impoverished people, certainly it was a church, maybe not so much with the state and the Roman Empire, but it was a church that cared deeply about feeding and caring for one another. What was initially one of the first calls in the book of Acts for the deacons? What did deacons do? They made sure everyone had enough to eat. They cared for people. So that was a deep desire and a deep commitment of the church, because people came to church and worshiped in communities of faith where people had material needs. And they did not separate that material need from the spiritual mission. But Peter Brown argues, and Walter Brueggemann points out, that that changed as the church became more powerful. And as wealthier people were in the church, and Peter Brown makes this argument by the 6th century, those civic material concerns became diminished and became more spiritualized in the sense of that's not what we do in the church. That's what we do outside of the church. In part because wealthy people didn't want to have to grapple with that in their churches. That's Peter Brown's argument that Walter Brueggemann elevates. And so Walter Brueggemann points out, he wonders if that kind of continues to happen in wealthy churches to this day. And Walter Brueggemann writes, as evidenced by the gentle admonition often made to pastors, don't become political. But he notes that what is political is also what is sacred. And so certainly there too, I think the argument is to care again about materiality and to work together, as challenging as it might be, like how we can faithfully, incrementally do the hard and necessary work of working toward ending poverty and racism, because materiality is from God as we continue to worship and work and live together. So I'm going to go, next slide, to something I found from the National Council of Churches, a really ecumenical group of, I guess what we would call mainline Protestants. This is from a report that they published in 1956 entitled The Christian Conscience and an Economy of Abundance. So they write, from the Christian standpoint, a minimum goal for the distribution of abundance is the right of all persons to a reasonable level of living, including food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, and access to cultural interests. So they note then, Americans are disturbed over our nation's abundance because of our spiritual inheritance and a deeply rooted conviction that spiritual values should be granted priority. By spiritual, we mean that order of life which God intends. Opposed to this is placed the term material or materialism. Here is implied a preoccupation of things. We start with the assumption that all of life is God's creation. Man's purpose as a part of that creation is to live within it in accordance with God's intention. All of life, therefore, within material surroundings, has a spiritual significance. So they too, in their day, are wrestling with the spirituality of the church and wrestling with how churches and how everyday Christians can work together toward addressing poverty. This is their point there. How can it be in a nation of abundance and a nation with increasing wealth and increasing power? There is also continuing to be increasing poverty. This is a mission that God is calling everyday Christians to get involved in, because this is a spiritual mission. And one quick thing to note there, certainly when we think about the rise of Christian nationalism today, is that when they met there is perhaps maybe a different kind of sense. I do think there is a sense that, and wrestling with that, certainly theocracy is not good. Like compelling people, or a theological term might be Christian triumphalism, to position Christians as above and better than other people of other faiths. That's really bad. But I think what the National Council of Churches was, I think they were probably less self-conscious about it then. But I think for all of us, I do think Christian nationalism is something we oppose. For the coercive and the judgmental components of it. But there is also this other idea that God has called us to be Christian, and God has called us to be Christian in this context and in this nation, so that we can be patriots and we can be patriotic and we can love God and we can love nation, we can love faith and we can love, and perhaps not love, but honor the flag and honor who we are in this country in ways that are positive, in ways that care deeply about like the common good, the flourishing of all. I think there are ways that we can criticize excessive militarism, for example, and police brutality, while honoring police officers, those serving in the military today, and veterans. I don't think these need to be combative tensions against one another. For example, we can care deeply about border security. We don't want people to come to this country that are not properly vetted, while at the same time, we can care deeply about immigrants and call for and advocate for just treatment, that we can balance together compassion and kindness with order and justice. Like, these are possible. I do believe it is possible, for example, for a Christian to have a view that desires more restrictive immigration policies while caring deeply for the immigrants in our midst. That it need not be racist or ethnocentric and the like. Now, sometimes I will say, in our kind of partisan, wild world that we live in today, sometimes it feels like a tightrope to walk that line. But I do think it is possible. And I think these are ways in which to be sure of our principles, to be sure of who and whose we are in God and what God is calling us to do, that would inform our policies. And ultimately, that would inform the politicians whom we support and those that we do not support. And so I think a lot of times it's not so good when politicians are the first thing, the first domino, and principles and policies are later dominoes. I do think in worship and communities of faith, I do think principles have to be the first domino, if you will. And next slide. And I think in talking about this, and when we talk about racism and poverty too, I think what we wrestle with is, and this is from Amy Plantinga-Paul, Reformed theologian who taught for a long time at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, recently retired. She writes this essay about the graced infirmity of the church, kind of Reformed theology from a feminist perspective. And she writes and argues that, look, politics is an inescapable dimension of the life of the church. That oftentimes those that say don't be political and are really trying to be comfortable and advocate for the status quo. That it's okay to be disruptive and it's okay to shake things up for a little bit. But her big point is that if a church is going to be a community of discernment and figure this hard stuff out together with the triune God leading us, it is inevitably going to be a community of argument. There is going to be disagreement. People who are doing hard and faithful discernment together, there's going to be times where people will disagree with one another. and it is how to provide space for disagreements to happen so that ultimately constructive, generative, productive answers can happen. It's not so good, I think, when we're dealing with hard things and we say we're a community of discernment and one person talks for a few minutes and everyone else is like, that's it, we're good and let's go. That's not really that faithful and honest and good community of discernment. A community of discernment is when there's time for discussion, there's time for opinion, there's time for mutual study and perspective, and even sometimes disagreeing about principles and policies and politicians and the like, so that we can get to be like a faithful community of discernment, so that we can focus on what is God calling us to do within our church and outside in our civic community, the context where God has placed us, so that we can be faithful, so that we can participate, whether in small ways or big ways, as Ms. Doris prayed, in doing our part, empowered by God, to end poverty and racism. With that, next slide, please. There is this verse from Matthew 4:4. I'm going to read from probably not the NRSV translation, but there are other translations that say, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. I think my point here is that what if we focused on the word alone, which means that God intends for all people to have bread and access to an abundant life. Certainly this says man should not live by bread alone, but this implies that God provides and God desires everyone to have bread. And what are the things, what are the systems, what are the structures, what are the policies and injustices that are preventing that from happening? The spiritual mission of the church is to be bearers of the gospel in the communities we inhabit. And our principles within a community of discernment and argument inspire us to engage in civic life or politics as a material manifestation of our spirituality. Our spiritual mission animates our communal engagement as we seek to enact the gospel and work toward the prayer on earth as it is in heaven. I have a quote there you can see from Liston Pope. He's a North Carolina native, I think a graduate of Thomasville High School and Duke University. Please don't hold the second school against him. But he was a Christian ethicist, taught and became the dean at Yale Divinity School, probably roughly, if he wrote this in 1943, a decade or two later. But he too wrestled with, in this case, largely with racism. And this is before the civil rights movement, or perhaps we would say the long civil rights movement, and wrestling with how to enact the gospel as a worshiping community, like in wrestling with racial injustice and intolerance and discrimination. And he writes, what the church needs to be is we need a clear mission with clarity and creativity. We need to let the church be the church, cleanse its own life, and so live out its principles as to create new faith, new conscience, and new hope in the world. And I do think this is a challenge, and other theologians have noted this, that at one level we live in a culture. We live in a context, and we live in a context where, I will say, politics, okay, I'll get to the next slide. I don't know about politics, but political identities really mean a lot to a lot of people. And so I think what we're trying to do in churches and in meetings and groups like this, and I see it in Matt and his ministry and from our other panelists, it is trying to provide a new, fresh voice, to provide theological, biblical and Christian insights and convictions on all of our pressing matters that are not simply echoes or mimicry of what we hear on political podcasts or what we're hearing from our politicians. I do think it is the mission of the church to find innovative ways. You're hearing all this out there, and not all of the voices are bad, and not all of the perspectives are bad, but here is something distinct about us worshiping, and I don't want to get into Christian triumphalism, but about us worshiping and praying and discerning together. Here's how these spiritual principles, here's how we interpret this truth from the Bible, inspires us to act and helps us to understand all of the podcasts that we are consuming and listening to, whether it be Ted Cruz or Megyn Kelly on the left, or Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson on the right and the left. You get what I'm saying there. So with that, next slide, and I'm almost done. There, I got that wrong. But here's the thing. Oh, one before, please. If you can go to the one with Eaton Hirsch, Politics is for Power. Oh, before. Yeah, thanks. So this is a book that came out in 2020. He's a political scientist from, I think, Tufts University, forgive me, or another school in that Boston area. But I like this book a lot. It's and this is an essay he wrote for The Atlantic before the book. His argument here is simply that like what a lot of us think politics is actually what he coined this term that I think is quite brilliant, political hobbyism. That we're actually not doing politics. So he writes, many people think they're deeply engaged in politics. They follow the news, reading articles like this one, debating the latest developments on social media. They might sign an online petition or throw a $5 donation at a presidential candidate. Or they might doom or joy scroll through their phones on like Twitter or what have you. Mostly, they consume political information as a way of satisfying their own emotional and intellectual needs. These people are political hobbyists. What they are doing is no closer to engaging in politics than watching SportsCenter is to playing football. So he compares what he and his friends do, and is quite telling in the book about how they engage politics, with people he met. A special needs teacher he met in Massachusetts, who he finds, she's actually really doing politics. She would like more funds for her school. And she was trying to build a coalition to run after-school curriculum that will better support her school. And ultimately, she needs to engage in politics because she needs laws to change. She needs more funding allocated from the local government for her school. And so she was building a coalition, going door to door, posting things on social media. He's like, that is politics. That is the work of politics because it is for power. This woman wants more power so that she can better serve and equip the students at her school. And he says, what she's doing is a lot different from what me and my friends are doing. Reading the New York Times, consuming politics, getting mad about the latest thing that President Trump did, this and that. And so she says, we're like, it's like fantasy football and saying, I'm a football player because I'm really keeping tabs on my fantasy football team. So what he encourages that let's really separate political hobbyism from politics, and let's try to all, and he's not writing as a Christian, but let's all try to get civically minded and involved in what politics really is, and to do that. And so I think this is what happens. So I think, thinking back to the spirituality of the church, and I'm almost done, I promise, I do think political hobbyism is corrosive, divisive, and bad for churches. I do think political hobbyism is actually what is happening in a lot of churches, and I do think we should say, no, that doesn't belong here, because that will only divide, that will only hurt, and that will only corrode like acid. Political hobbyism, we don't want that here. But what we do want is to figure out how we can be more faithfully engaged in political work or in civic and communal work, so that we care deeply about the people who we worship with, but we also care deeply about the people in our neighborhoods, in our state, and in our nation. I think that's work that we ought to do together. And finally, I think I have two last slides. One is to note simply, and I think on poverty, this is what we're wrestling with. I think you may know this sociologist that retired from UC Berkeley, Arlie Russell Hochschild. She wrote this great book, and its timing just worked out great because I think she published it in 2016, and then people were really surprised because when President Trump defeated Hillary Clinton in that election. And so she says, I spent a lot of time with the people who voted for Trump. And she says, what she found in Louisiana and the like and in Appalachia is that, they are really angry. And what she calls is that they have deep stories. And she notes that both conservatives and liberals have deep stories about who they are and what their values are. She also notes that deep stories don't need to feel completely accurate, but they have to feel true. And she writes, after spending all this time with people, for example, in Louisiana, she finds that their deep story focused on the American dream. Social mobility is the American dream. But what if you work hard and play by the rules? You can have a better life. But what happens when that dream doesn't come true? And she writes, that's what a lot of people are wrestling with in this country, that the deep story of the American dream feels broken. And I think in 2025, I know this was written about 10 years ago, I think that is something we are continuing to wrestle with. I think some progressives challenge the notion of the American dream in its entirety, that the American dream in and of itself, the idea of social mobility, isn't working. And that needs to be grappled with. And I think this is where our community of discernment becomes a community of argument. I will share with you, I've been reading all of that, I've been thinking through all of that, and I don't quite know. I think I still hold to the American, for me, I would say I would like to refine, and I would like to reform, and I would like a better American dream that provides opportunity for all. I don't know quite in this context of democratic capitalist United States that can fully go away. And I acknowledge other Christians and other civic leaders, other people I read and listen to and work with, they disagree with me on that. They believe we need a new dream. And I note that Dr. Martin Luther King, I read through a lot of his stuff over the summer. He appealed to the Bible, he appealed to the Constitution, but he appealed quite often to the American dream, that was the desire for social mobility possibilities for all, and that people based on skin color would not be separated from that possibility. Now, what some might say is that if King were here today, he might have changed his mind, and he was, even towards the end of his life before it was tragically shortened, thinking differently about that. And I think that's something that we are all wrestling with. What's our deep story, and how do we understand the American dream? And how are we going to make that possible? Or if we don't believe that that should be anymore, how do we provide a new dream? Again, not theocracy, but that it's based on Christian principles, not forced upon others, but that can really work. What do we believe about the American dream? What do we want policies and politicians to do about the American dream? I think that's something I continue to wrestle with. Finally, though, last slide, and I am done. I do find great inspiration from the civil rights movement in that era. This is from a woman who was involved, Barbara Jones Omalade, who was involved with not the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I will say a group that was more radical, but I will also say a group that was more inclusive, particularly of women. That women found more roles of leadership, autonomy, and agency in SNCC than they did in the SCLC. But she writes that this was like a powerful movement in her life, that this was a time where she and other young people, and old people too, they got together and they tried to build a beloved community strong enough to change all lives. And she writes, through my lens as a Christian, though SNCC was not a Christian movement, I can also see the way faith moved among the believers responsible for the spirit of the movement. Their prayer, songs, and sacrifice taught me the true meaning of faith as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. As an adult, I finally understand what gave Fannie Lou Hamer and the others such courage and such power in their songs. It was their faith and their prayers. And I think that's what we're desiring and that we're hoping for today, that it will be our faith and our prayers that lead us to be a part of movements of change and transformation. And I'll end with Lemuel Haynes' words way back when, after the American Revolutionary War, was not our blessed Lord a political preacher? And now we've got to figure out how to make that dream and that reality true and lively in what we're doing today. So that's it. I'm sorry, I probably went on a little longer than I wanted. That's the lecture portion. And now it's like the real fun stuff, right, Matt and others? I think we're going to have a panel, Q&A, and all of that. So I'm going to move this, and I'll turn it back to Matt.
It feels so good, but I am going to shut this. I saw it blowing some stuff off. It fell a little cold, I'm sorry. Any chance we have to keep the doors open, we try to take advantage of it. Well, if the panelists want to make their way up here, I'm going to actually be, can y'all hear me? Is it on now? Yeah. I'm going to be at the pulpit mic, again, so that we can share the wireless ones. But looky there. And I was actually going to suggest that maybe William sit in the middle, since he has the, oh, you took the, okay, all right. Well, that's all right. Well, we'll still pass it around. But yeah, thank you so much, Reverend Dr. William Yu, for all of that. And a lot of it, I think, is going to connect to the conversations that we're going to have now. But again, you've got everybody's bio is in the handout here. I may tell on them as we go, a little fun fact that's not listed in there as everybody shares. But to start out, so for the next 45 minutes or so, we've got the panel discussion. I have set an alarm on my phone, so if you hear it going off, it's because I don't want to be trying to keep up with this the whole time, but it's to let us know when to turn it over to y'all. But be writing questions as you have them, and just kind of get Allison's attention. I don't know where there she is. Get Allison's attention when you have one that you want to turn in, and we'll try to go from there. But one of the things that, William, you said that really resonated with me is this notion of context, right? And that what's it mean to be a person of faith in a particular place. We are right now here in Northeast Charlotte in what is sometimes affectionately referred to as University City or Newell, depending on how long you have been here. But since we are about 3 minutes from UNCC's campus, I want to talk about life in higher education for just a second. I know some of you work in it directly. All of you have connections to it indirectly and directly as raising kids and the like through school as well. But with higher education, I think if the church has kind of atrophied some of its muscles for disagreeing well, that what's it mean to discern together? I'm curious if that is still true on college and seminary campuses, right? That I think that in higher ed, we are exposed to environments that push us, that stretch what we think we know, that maybe help subvert some false narratives that we have picked up along the way, and that stretch us. But I wonder, what is it about higher education that enables that? What is it that actually allows folks to have that platform, those years, whether at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, to be able to do that type of wrestling? And so again, 3 of you work in higher ed directly, but y'all just, one of you pop the microphone on and give it a shot.
Great. Well, thanks, Matt, for having us, and thank you, William, for starting our conversation. I'm Julia Watkins. I'm the chaplain at Davidson College, starting my 3rd year. And I would say on Davidson's campus right now, we're holding a number of things in tension. Davidson has a freedom of expression clause that really makes room for disagreement and for people to share their voices in a variety of different ways. There are limits to that clause that talk about harm that might be caused through our speech. And we see students wrestling with that and the whole community wrestling with that in a variety of different ways. Fundamentally, I would say what maybe lays fertile ground for this type of work and conversation on our campus, though, is that students are in close relationship and proximity with each other even when they don't choose it. So they're sitting alongside each other in the classroom, they're coming from many backgrounds and perspectives, and their learning isn't limited to the classroom, but extends in late night conversations in their residence halls and connection with the broader Davidson and Charlotte communities and around the world. So they're going to come into contact with perspectives that challenge them. They're sort of freshly out from under their parents' roofs, and I think open to new ways of perceiving the world. And I think are in a position maybe to care about each other in a way that's not so othering as we're encountering in the news and sort of broader conversation today.
Hi, I'm Stephen Cheney. I'm the university minister at UNC Charlotte. Thanks, Matt, for having us. Thank you, William. I think that one of the things that I've found for a number of years is that the church at its most generative is seeking the truth, and higher education at its most generative is also seeking the truth. And those aren't necessarily colliding. Sometimes they do collide, but when you have 2 institutions that seek the same thing, there can be eagerness and curiosity. It can be a wealth of learning. And then also you can have negativity as well in both institutions. But I feel that that is a prime time, especially for undergraduates and young people, to not only form their minds, but form their faith and form their politics. And so it's, I think, in part because of that same pursuit of truth.
And I realized I was so anxious to get started, I forgot to ask y'all to actually introduce yourselves. So if we can push pause for 1 second. Julia and Steve, y'all just did, but for the other 3, can you just tell everybody who you are and maybe say why on earth you gave up 2 hours of a Saturday to be here, right? Like, why is it, if you think these types of conversations matter and are essential today?
Hey y'all, I'm Greg Gerald. I am an independent scholar and writer, but also work as a community organizer with the Redress Movement, which works on corrective action for historic housing injustices. So we design community-led campaigns to try to win victories for redress and the long effects of desegregation. So this is politics and faith is the work that I've been doing for a long time. I guess that's why I'm here. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Justin Perry. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and clinical addiction specialist, founder and therapist at Perry Counseling, Healing, and Recovery, where myself and a team of clinicians work with folks ages 12 and up, dealing in the spaces of mental health, addiction, trauma through talk therapy, art therapy, and various modalities. But I'm also a Christian who grew up here in Charlotte, Little Rock, AME Zion, most of my life, Covenant Parish Presbyterian, and now currently at the Grove. And also somebody who, again, does work in the community and does advocacy work and does space in the work of racial healing. And the reason why I'm here is because the church and Christianity has always been central to the challenges we have, right? This is not a new book, it's just a new chapter. And so, I'm certainly just glad to be a part of kind of connecting the dots to where we came from to where we are, while hopefully writing a new chapter of where we go.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Well, and so to continue with this notion of not a new chapter and conversations that have been wrestled with for quite a while, inside and outside of the church, we spoke a little bit to life in higher education and what it is about that season that might be generative in ways that doesn't always show up elsewhere in the world. But I wonder, for any and all of you, what is it that could translate? What can we learn from higher education that could allow those same types of relationships, those same types of learning and wrestling to try to create that atmosphere outside of college or seminary into the real world?
Greg, I can ask you in your work. So your work is specific, precise, historic, and material. And so I think that resonates more with a broader group of people than kind of what happened the post-summer of 2020 racial reckoning, where there was a lot of introspective work on white fragility, the problem of whiteness, and racial trauma, though I will say many people of color, that's real. But I did feel like a lot of that work, it was, okay, we've read this book, we've talked about this. What's the next step? It's to read the next book and the next book. And at one level, I've been gratified. Maybe that's not the right word, because my book has shown up as maybe the 6th, 7th, 8th book, and then I get invited to talk with these groups. And so sometimes they ask me at the end on Zoom or in person, what other books do you recommend? What are 5 books you recommend? And I always say, more than that, I want to talk together, what are 5 things we can do? I think, you've read my book, you've read the Kendi book, you've read the D'Angelo book, you've read these other books, Michael Eric Dyson and the like. So I think you're good. I think you're good on books. So now it is figuring out, what we can do. So Greg, I'll ask you, so I find the what we can do is more productive, than that model or approach of, for example, DEI. And that's also the corporate model of DEI too, that I really, whether I like it or not, I don't know. I just don't think it's that effective.
The next book is my book. I have some copies in the back. So the notion of politics is power. The goal is power, as you very eloquently described in that example of watching sports is not playing football. Right? So powerful people inside our community, for instance, in the specifics of my research, raised 5 different neighborhoods in the city of Charlotte that were black neighborhoods, primarily through the federal funding of the Urban Renewal Program that existed from 1949 to 1974. No recompense has ever been given to the descendants of those people, and that is because the way power has been aligned prevents resources from moving in the directions of those affected communities. You can't tackle all of that at once, but the way that you arrange power is by starting with one small piece and building your muscles in that way. You attack a specific plot and the specific owner of that. With Redress Movement right now, we're coming for Atrium Health and the Pearl, which has made some promises about housing and that development, and then got tax money to support those promises, and then fully pretended that they never made those promises. That's what's currently happening, right? So you want to change power, you got to go after one specific place so that you're reorienting the way that our community is built, structured. You can't win it all at once. And so those big, huge ideas are really important, but you have to have the discipline to enact them in small ways, in specific places.
I love what Greg said, and I'm gonna nudge back on what you said as well, right? I think the issue is not really a matter of the educating. It's that a lot of times people don't want to do what they're educated to do, right? And so it is easier to keep learning. But sometimes it makes very clear what needs to happen, but it's like, oh yeah, but that doesn't quite feel comfortable. Can we learn something different, right? And so I think, again, speaking about how we apply this in the real world, so I do a lot of trainings, workshop, consultation in organizations, right? And right now I'm working in a California hospital system, but we're doing it for a year. So we're not just doing a one-off. A lot of people want to kind of do a one-off conversation. And the truth is, actually, there are different levels of understanding of these systems. Like for me, as somebody who's lived 44 years as a black man here in Charlotte, my understanding of race is different because it was a core part of my learning to be able to navigate. For a lot of people, it's an elective class that maybe I get later in my career. But we operate as though we're all at the same place, right? And so what happens is you have to figure out how to teach to the middle, but then what you have to do is figure out how does what we're learning translate to what's happening, and how do you operate in your sphere of influence, right? And so if I'm operating with 5 different hospitals, we're gonna give you the framework to guide us, to get us to where we are. We're gonna help you see how it shows up in medical systems now, but then we're gonna challenge you to do the work of assessing where you currently are, where do these gaps show up, and once you see where these gaps show up, start working with the people who are affected by them to figure out what are the steps to rectify them, right? But that's the part we often don't do because, again, at some point we're gonna have to be pushed as those in power to maybe do something different, and that's uncomfortable, so it's easier to keep learning.
Yeah, I want to stick there for just a second, and I saw you reach for it too, Steve. Do you want to jump in now?
Well, I think, though, it is also crucial to realize that there is a whole world out there who isn't learning. And, you know, we might have all the books that we need in Newell Presbyterian Church or the Presbytery or the denomination, but, I mean, I deal with a lot of students, more students than mainline Protestants that come from backgrounds where they haven't read, they haven't had the history, they don't know that maybe their own Christian faith is being co-opted and retranslated into, say, Christian nationalism. They don't know the history of the United States, much less of the world, much less of Christianity. And so there is an important work that the church can do and higher education can do to educate people. I mean, we are in the business of education. And so, I mean, my hope is that at some point and someday, our students will do the work and are doing the work now that with Greg and the work like what Greg is doing, and they have plenty of mentors and there's good work being done, and the work like Justin. But I think we do get insulated in this idea that we don't need another book necessarily. We need to do more work. At the same time, there's churches down the road where they've probably never read any book. So I think that it's hard to, well, maybe I'll just let y'all, the experts, talk. But I would say get 100 books and 100 more and 100 more. And if you feel that you know it all, then great, teach it to the world.
Man. Yeah, amen. So actually, I'm going to come back to you, Steve. You quite literally teach the course or teach courses on Christian nationalism. And you talked about the students that you engage with on a regular basis. I wonder who takes that class, right? Like, who are the students that come in? What are the engagements you're having? What are you learning from your students and your research as to like how that is spreading beyond just one person reading one book? Who takes these classes?
Well, I would love to say that the students who take these classes are the best students at UNC Charlotte, but I've also been known to not like grading, so I'm sure that they probably like a professor who, is a little easier. Most of these students are Christian. I mean, UNC Charlotte is a diverse university, no doubt, and it's not a Christian course. We basically, what I teach there in the realm of Christian nationalism comes in either a course on religion and democracy, which I've taught before and I continue to teach, or a class on conspiracy theories in American culture. And Christian nationalism comes up a great number of times as well. I think that students who take these courses are genuinely curious of politics. Maybe they're political hobbyists, maybe they just watch TikTok, but they know something's wrong with the world. I would say very few of our students are like members of Turning Point. Most of them are probably more progressive or at least disengaged with politics or upset with the political structure that we have today. We have people in this room who know far more than I do about the context of UNC Charlotte and college students, but the Christian nationalism aspect of our courses or my courses, it's always eye-opening. Students are really surprised that they have this experience of, say, a civil religion. It's in the air, and they didn't realize it. And when you teach a student that, in the fourth grade, when you stood up to pledge allegiance to the flag, that was a sacred religious act, and it was if they were Christian or Muslim, or if they grew up in a faith tradition, it is in odds or at odds with that faith tradition. And so that is an eye-opening experience to most of the students.
And don't let him fool you. He is the Reverend Doctor sitting over here. So dual ordination, dual doctorate. But I do want to ask one more campus-specific question to you, Chaplain Watkins. Davidson just unveiled their newest sculpture, right? With these hands, a memorial to the enslaved and the exploited. We've heard conversations start around transformative work, performative work, and ongoing conversations. What is life like on Davidson's campus, and what conversations, what actions are coming? This was, 2 weeks ago that y'all did this? So still new, but what's the pulse like in the shadow of that?
Yeah, so for those of you who aren't aware, Davidson recently did unveil this memorial. It's a part of a larger history of work that started in 2017 with the Commission on Race and Slavery that is meant to help Davidson explore and understand its history so that we can honor those who built the college with the work of their own hands, fingerprints still of the people who were enslaved, who crafted some of the original buildings on our campus, and then take ownership for that history so that we can move towards a more just and equitable future. The memorial is a part of that bigger picture, like you said. The college invested millions of dollars to have this piece of public art right in the center of our campus at a place where it's visible from Main Street. And I think it's fair to engage in dialogue about the value of that investment. Lots and lots of money. on its own, it's not enough. And so alongside the funds that are invested in that memorial are funds put towards tenured professorships in Africana studies, scholarships for students, and the college is actively working to rebuild relationships with descendants of those who were enslaved or exploited, some of whom live still right in our own community, some of whom long ago migrated to other parts of the country. There's a living history museum that highlights the stories of those who have been a part of our community over the years. And I really living because names are continuously being added as people feel comfortable sharing their experience and being sort of counted on record as a part of this history. So I would say, like, the sculpture itself, it's a way of publicly holding ourselves accountable for ongoing work as a community. It's also a way of honoring, again, these hands that did build our campus in so many different spaces over the years, who really made it possible for students to pursue truth as a part of their higher education experience. And maybe miraculously in today's climate, I think that the sculpture has been overwhelmingly positively received by pretty much every corner of our campus community, as I understand it, across political and ideological differences. I know there was a lot of attention to sort of the reception and well received by those members of the community who have been a part of building the college past, present, and future. So it's public. You're invited to come see it. The museum's open during the week. Hope that it will be a powerful space of reflection and sanctuary and future action.
Thanks, Julie. Yes, and speaking of past, present, and future, I want to talk about leadership for a minute. And each of you serves in various leadership capacities in and around the city of Charlotte, Davidson, or Atlanta, and the country as a whole. And, you know, Dr. Yu talked about SNCC in his presentation. And so in the Civil Rights Movement, the students, part of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Council, the young people, whether it was the Children's Crusades as well through the Civil Rights Movement, or today, Steve mentioned Turning Point, right? So there's this big focus on young adults. I wonder what you see as a need for leadership for young adults, but also broadly, right? Look, our room is not filled with 10th graders, right? And so for young adults, for seasoned adults, and everybody in between, what do you think is needed in leadership positions throughout this whole conversation?
I would say humility. I think for those of us who are more seasoned, as I've crossed over at this stage of my life, right? I think there's a level of humility that we need with our younger folks. You know, lots of times we kind of are dismissive and they don't know, they don't get, you know, and what I realize is it's not accurate, right? Again, I having grown up here in Charlotte, again, I always tell people I remember being in high school, my two things always stand out. Sophomore year, met Rosa Parks. Next year, court case was launched to end school desegregation here in Charlotte. And again, I was a junior in high school, and I knew that ending the desegregation we had will lead to explosions of resegregation, not only of people, but of resources and opportunity, right? I wasn't even old enough to vote yet, right? But we had friends that went and protested at the courthouse in partnership with folks like James Ferguson, who just passed away, and things like that, right? So again, the older voices were partnering with us, right? It wasn't saying, you guys don't know what you're talking about, because in that case we did, which tells me that there's some things that our younger folks are talking about right now that they know about that maybe we don't, right? And so to me, I think the humility is figuring out how do we partner and collaborate together. You know, I always talk about things in the lens of white supremacy, and I look at that as kind of the piñata. Everybody's not going to hit it at the same angle or hit it with the same tool, but if we're all committed to striking and not knocking the piñata down, let's figure out how can we do that collectively. And so to me, I think we have to listen to them better, and then hopefully they also listen to the wisdom of older folks as well, because I think some of where we are in our country right now is because some younger folks rolled the dice because they thought, nah, all that stuff you guys talk about that happened in the past, that would never happen again, right? And there's older folks, and I'll say it, especially older black folks, who knew fully what this country was capable of, who are not shocked at all by anything that's happening right now, and who said it very plainly. But again, we're dismissed by folks who are younger across race and across the spectrum and everything else. So humility is something we have to figure out how do we have more of collectively when it comes to leadership.
I would just say briefly that the woman behind SNCC, who called together that first gathering at Shaw University in Raleigh in 1960, was named Ella Baker, native of Warrenton, North Carolina. And one of her famous dicta was that strong people don't need strong leaders. When you invest in communities that can act with self-efficacy, then leadership of us old folks or growing older folks becomes less and less important. Power gets diffuse, in other words, rather than held and grappled onto tightly.
I might just add an encouragement that young people and all of us have the capacity to make change on the ground that's right beneath our feet. I think something that's different about today's landscape is that social media draws our attention, and media more broadly, towards many crises in many parts of the world, and it's important to pay attention to those. And I think young people and all of us risk falling into pits of despair for things that we can't change halfway around the world. But each of us is immersed in our own community, kind of hyper-locally, and then moving out. So to have some hope that little by little change can come, I think young people still believe they can make a difference, and to be able to direct that in ways that really can move us forward, I think is an opportunity before us.
Yeah, and with that, you use the word hopeful, right? I wonder whether it's your work with students or with organizing, what is it you're seeing today, maybe one thing that makes you hopeful and one thing that makes you anxious? And you can pick the order. But when you look at the work that you're engaged in, I think to Julia's point, the honesty that it's easy to fall into despair at times, but what are those stories that are keeping you hopeful?
Yeah, I can just pop in. I mean, I feel like there are lots of stories that aren't making the news that are sort of hyper-local right now. And I can just offer sort of one really finite example. We have a group of students in our office who sort of serve as spiritual ambassadors on campus. They formed a small team to work around questions of morality and spirituality this semester. And 3 of them, from very different backgrounds, a traditional Catholic, a conservative Jew, and a relatively progressive Episcopalian, have been working together all semester to organize a vigil for peace and nonviolence, they're calling it, but really in response to school shootings. And it's been a labor for them throughout the semester to discern how that can be something that is authentically theirs and also of service to the community that's grieving in big and small ways this reality in our midst. But they've practiced a lot of forbearance with each other. They've been patient. They've held their moral center, I think, while being willing to compromise. And I just feel like there are stories upon stories like those that aren't in the headlines of people who are humanizing each other and giving me hope.
Anyone else have one?
The people of Chicago have used whistles to drive ICE out of neighborhoods to rescue every single person they could rescue from the grip of Christofascism. And you couldn't name a single leader who did that. The communities did that themselves.
All right, I'll go with the anxious first, so we'll cover that part, right? See, therapists doesn't run from that, right? The anxious part is the amount of disconnected young men that we have that have been mobilized in a lot of toxic ways because they do have a lot of legitimate concerns and a lot of legitimate vulnerabilities, but have not had a space to actually figure out how to deal with those, right? And like anything else, like in pretty much any gang, you know, the Red Pill Nation, the Podcast Bros, and everybody else like that has tapped in and formulated a gang where people are still isolated and carrying out a lot of harmful things to other people and to themselves. I think the hopeful thing that I have right now is I think the opportunity for greater intersectionality. You know, I always, when we talk about the system of white supremacy, I always lay it out as white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male landowners, right? It's not just one piece, it's all of these pieces, Protestant, again, the Christianity being a part of it, but also what whiteness is has always kind of shifted. It's shifted. Again, at one point, the Irish weren't white, but then they became white. At one point, the Germans weren't white, they became white. At one point, the Catholics weren't Christian, till there was more religious diversity, and now they just became Christian, right? But even I think about, like, I do a lot of work where we're operating with Black and immigrant communities. Our immigrant communities are often been used as a wedge in between the Black and white. And I think a lot of folks, when we're seeing what's happened with ICE, a lot of folks who fell in immigrant communities and saw themselves as white and protected have now seen that this structure does not see you that way, right? And so it's created opportunities for us to have true conversation about how do we work together? How do we stop being played against each other? And how do we collectively realize that we are a part of each other's liberation? And so to me, that's something that I'm hopeful about, that I hope that we don't just kind of try to survive our ways out of when this is going on, but continue on if we get out of this survival mode.
Do you want to? Okay, I think, so certainly what is hopeful in my local area is, again, to Greg's point, it is small and it is piece by piece, but increasing openness through voting for affordable and more mixed economic neighborhoods. Now, I don't want to overstate it that it's a whole lot, but there have been several plots of land and sites that it's been very contentious. And for a lot of the reasons, the whole YIMBY-NIMBY thing. But what I found hope is that in the churches in Decatur, not all of them, and I don't want to overstate it, but real honest, faithful, full conversations about like what affordable housing, what mixed economic neighborhoods mean, and how that might participate, not the whole thing, but that is a piece of getting to what some Christians call shalom, or a more just and a more whole community. And so even grappling with, and it wasn't so much, because it wasn't so much housing, so much land, but what does home ownership mean? And how do we wrestle with more housing and mixed economic neighborhoods does affect in some ways for some generational wealth. When this country, it is challenging. Jerusalem Demsas, when writing for The Atlantic, and Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson quote her in their Abundance book, and now she started her own Substack called The Argument. She wrote several years ago, it didn't go as viral as I thought it might have, in part because probably it was a topic. She writes, is home ownership really the problem in the United States? Because she writes about how, and thinking, she is a Black woman, thinking about one of the problems with generational wealth and the racial wealth gap and the like is because what we do know continuing on today, predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, real estate values are less than predominantly white and, for example, some East Asian, South Asian neighborhoods. And so you want to fix that problem. But her argument is, what if that whole notion is the problem in and of itself? We want more abundant housing. But generational wealth, if it's tied into a home and a mortgage, scarcity helps that generational wealth go up. And so she's wrestling with all these things, and it is really quite complicated. So much of the foundations of this country are built on that. So, but what I saw, long story short, happening in my little neck of the woods in Decatur is people really talking about that and wrestling with that, and that influencing how they voted locally. on what we should do about like these plots of land and what kind of apartments, what kind of homes should be built there. And so that was positive. I will say one thing, the challenge certainly is, I don't know if this is true. It's not sure if my kids are 17 and 14, but for a lot of people I meet, I'm 47 now, I do find political identities are just really strong. I do think all of us are tribal by nature. I just think it's changed for Christians as a church historian. I would say likely in the 50s and 60s, and there have been studies on this, apologies, I know it's not the most popular thing to say, I don't remember his name, but a Duke sociologist from Duke University did note, like back 2 generations ago, maybe even a generation ago, like in the mainstream, mainline Protestant, like denominational identities were really strong. Like it was like I think one of the anecdotes is like we're a Lutheran family. So, and one of the kids came home and daughter said, I'm gonna marry this Methodist boy. And it was like, you can't do that. It was like this real strong thing, this real tie. I don't think that's true anymore. It was like, what, he's a Christian? Great, let's go. But the whole idea of denominational identity, so those of us who are Presbyterian, are you a United Presbyterian? Are you a PCUS? Are you a Seceder, a Covenanter, Associate Reformed, PCA, PCUSA? There are all these things. And so tribal identities have always been a part of us. But I think they're less denominational with the breakdown of kind of religion and stuff like that in this country, but it is really political. Like now I think it was, we're a Democrat family and you brought home this Republican boy, or we're a Republican family and you brought home this Democrat, kid and want to marry them? No way. Or even they said, looking at resumes, like that was something that employers didn't like. You're a young Republican, you're a young Democrat, you're a Democratic Socialist, DSA, all of that stuff. So I do think it's kind of figuring out, like I think those tribal identities with politics are pretty strong in the world that I inhabit. And like, how do you break through? Like, how does truth, how does Christianity, how does love, justice, and how does local work break through all of that? I do find that is still pretty challenging. But I find local things do help with that. I don't know, Greg, if you've seen that, and Steve and all of us.
Yeah, I was just involved in a campaign around a transportation tax here that had some of the most progressive people and libertarians working together opposed to the transportation tax, right? So those kind of hyper-local things actually can forge some sorts of relationships. Now, we're not going to see pretty much anything else the same way, but it did form sort of a reminder for a lot of us that we're a lot closer together, and we have this need for solidarity that it's easy to forget when you're just consuming the news.
Yeah, I want to stay on this identity thing for a bit, and I appreciate the therapist among us pointing to intersectionality, right? Because, especially later in his life, King was criticized, stay with civil rights, man, pick a lane. Don't mess with the Poor People's Campaign or Vietnam, but assuming we can walk and chew gum at the same time, we're located at a pretty busy intersection today, right? We said poverty and racism. But we're also talking about housing. We're talking about the church, about U.S. history. Why do all of these things belong in conversation together, if they do? And why on earth have them at a church?
I always, again, going back to the framework that I said at the beginning, they've always been linked, right? So again, if you go white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male landowner meaning the elite, that was who could vote originally. That was who could hold office originally. So even if you were a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male, but you were not in the elite, you couldn't do those things. But they used race as a divider, like after Bacon's Rebellion. So again, really understanding that, again, what makes classism work is racism and vice versa. I spent my first 2.5 years of my career working in Stanley County, right? And where I worked, it was largely white, rural, poverty. You talk about politically, if you look at Stanley County, you'll see 22 precincts, you'll see 1 blue and 21 red, right? My wife actually just is doing some work now. She's doing some regional work, and she went out there and she was telling the people that she worked with that her husband had a soft place in their heart for Stanley County. Like, oh, who's your husband? Whatever. And she was like, well, you might not know he was black or whatever. And then the woman was like, wow, a black man working in Stanley County, I bet he's got some stories to tell, right? And I was like, Stanley County is aware, and that's what I love about them, right? Now, the thing is, I still remember doing an assessment one time with a guy, and his treatment was paid for by state and county funding. His income was disability income. And in the middle of our assessment, he said, I can't stand people getting these government handouts. And I was like, hey, I am a clinician, not an activist right now, right? And I'm trying to get him to come back to treatment again. But my brain says, my guy, without government handouts, you couldn't afford me, right? Heck, I couldn't afford me then. But again, what I recognized pretty clearly was the genius was government handouts was what he thought people with my skin get. And so he was voting constantly to eliminate the things that would prevent him eventually from having financial bankruptcy, right? Whether it's Bacon's Rebellion, whether it's the Southern Strategy, and I can name all of what's happened in the last post-Obama years, it's the same game. It's the same game. And so what we've done is, so again, when you're talking about whether it's Hillbilly Elegy, whether it's the book you referenced, whether it's Dying of Whiteness, I encourage you all to read Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzl. Like what you see is the political elite class leverages the white working class Christians to bring them in and to continue doing their bidding. And they don't give them anything of material wealth, but they do give them cultural comfort, and they provide harm to those who they feel like are the threats. And so that's why even what we see what's happening with ICE and everything else, it's not happening in secret. It needs to be visible, because while you are getting more poor and your farm is going under and everything else like that, you would need to feel some sense of joy, which will eventually still be misery, by watching what's happening to these other people, right? Maybe you're not going to help me, but at least you can harm those who I think have ruined my life.
Yeah, well, and I could ask y'all questions all day. I think y'all know I came with a lot more. But for the sake of turning to everyone gathered here, I'm going to ask one final one while we collect the cards from folks. But one of the things I appreciate is, so often it's easy to feel like racism, poverty, those things are so big, so entrenched, so removed that regular old folks can't do anything about it, right? Greg has said multiple times about communities being able to activate within themselves. And so I think y'all have all highlighted William's talk, Greg's book, which, by the way, is back there. All those books that are back there are fantastic. We've got, not How to Read the Bible Today. What's yours? Start Here, about engaging the Bible in 2025 and what this looks like. Reckoning with History with William Yu, and Our Trespasses from the saxophonist among us. But this notion of contingency, right, that things didn't have to be this way, which also means things could be different, right? And so one of the people who I really love, Jemar Tisby, talks about this framework of ARC, awareness, relationship, commitment. We've talked a lot about awareness, right? And sometimes we do awareness well, we being folks that look like me. Sometimes we are stronger in relationship. But the commitment piece is what I want to end with, right? You have all these folks here who would agree that we need to do more than just learn something. And so what is it, if you could say one thing for people to do when they leave today, what is that one thing that you hope folks would do? And you all have to answer that.
Just go down the line here. On some level, I feel like the response to this question is as numerous as the people in this room, as we've talked about sort of the hyper-contextualism at play here. As somebody who's working with young people, I think I would say be willing to plant seeds whose fruit you might not see, because there's another generation coming to steward them.
I want you to sign up to be part of my campaign to tackle Atrium and their commitments at the Pearl. And I say that not in a self-serving way, but more as an example of doing something highly specific. Because if you don't do something highly specific, then you'll never get to the big, broad goals that we all share.
Okay,
Okay, so one thing, right, Matt? So I would say one thing is to worship one Sunday a year in a different community of faith, perhaps a different race, ethnicity, or class, whatever have you be. And sometimes some will say, what if it's in a different language I don't understand? You can do it one Sunday a year to worship and support with an offering, to worship and be among people. Maybe to do it in a small group if you don't want to do it by yourself. That is one thing, in addition to all the awareness, to worship in a different community of faith.
I would say challenge, make sure that your church is a part of tackling the affordable housing crisis in our community. Churches own an abundance of land here. And if your church is not doing something to work towards helping that, again, whether it's use of their land, whether it's figuring out how to partner with somebody else is doing it, make sure, challenge your church and ask, what are we doing to address what we call a crisis, even though we don't respond to it like a crisis, the affordable housing crisis here in this community. And if they're not doing anything, then challenge and say, okay, well now we need to start, so be a part of starting it.
I invite you to come visit me at UNC Charlotte and spend some time listening to students one-on-one.
And I get to go spend some time with students every once in a while, at least a couple times a year at Niner United. It's Wednesday night still, right? And it's on campus, but that's a tagline there. So I've got a couple questions. I'm going to do my best to see if we can get through most of them and try to reiterate or condense some of them. But talking about proximity, do you think that churches should be focused on the area closest to them, their own geographic area, circles of influence, and or engaged in the broader world?
So part of what's hard is that we don't have parishes anymore, for the most part, right? We drive, many of us drive 15 or 20 minutes to church. So I think you have to work with your folks to get excited and engaged in the thing that matters to you. And if it's on your corner, excellent. And if it takes you downtown, that's fine too. I think it should be local, but I think you should do the thing that gives you energy, that you want deeply to be engaged in, and not to worry too much about whether it's on your corner or a couple of miles away.
I can maybe just reflect that I think often engagement in global contexts as the church can help us see our patterns and systems here more clearly, to see at arm's length some echoes of those patterns in contexts where we might not be so defensive about the realities at hand. I think that has a role to play in shaping how we respond to things right here on the ground. I think about having traveled with church groups to the US-Mexico border and folks saying, well, this isn't really our issue. Let people in Texas and Arizona deal with this, and then realizing that we indeed have people who have migrated in our midst, just as one example of how that kind of over there, up here connection can work.
I never thought I'd say this in a Presbyterian church, but John Wesley said the world is our parish. And so with that in mind, I think that we take our students across the world and we work with them locally as well, but we do that as students who are studying. There's so many mission farms. There's so much volunteerism that it's tragic in many ways, and it's much harder to do that locally. If you're involved locally, you can't get away with just watching. You have to be emotionally involved, physically involved, spiritually involved, and so to be aware of the world's context, but to work locally.
Well, and speaking of local, so Charlotte, Justin mentioned a lot of churches with land. There's also a lot of churches with cemeteries. And we have a number of churches who have cemeteries of formerly enslaved folks. What are ways that you have seen that are really generative and positive of churches engaging those histories on their land? And what are ways that you have seen them maybe perpetuating the same things that they hope to not be repeating?
I think that like diving deeply into your congregation's own story, for instance, as the Providence Presbyterian has done, one of their members I see here, I think it helps to provide some context for what it is that God might be calling your congregation to do right now. Your story doesn't end or begin at any certain point. Right? So to understand the stream that you've stepped into can help you to figure out what the next kind of work is to do. So I don't know that that really answers your question well, except to dig as deeply as you can into those stories and to find the ways that they are illuminating the directions that God is pulling you for whatever the next stage is.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just kind of piggybacking. I think you were answering the question. I think it starts with assessing your role in creating the conditions that we're in, right? What is the history of our church, right? Because then when I see what the sins that we participated in, it also gives me the opportunity to see where the places of potential reconciliation and atonement are, right? And so, and that's why I said, to me, it's like recognizing that this is an ongoing book. And I always operate under what I call compassion and accountability. Maybe we didn't create it, but once we've inherited, we now have an understanding of figuring out what's the next right thing to do going forward, right? So my job is to understand, to your point, what did we do to help create the neighborhoods this way? What things did we do that drove out certain people out of housing and things like that? And again, I can't go back and undo those things, but now I can be a part of trying to figure out how do we show up differently in the next chapter of this, and then maybe helping bring people back in or rehouse or whatever else it is as an atonement for what's already happened before us.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate, and I think it is to Justin, your point, it is to move. I don't think shame and guilt are really what we're after when we do deep histories of our churches and the like, but I think it is responsibility and repair. That we are not guilty of the sins of our ancestors, but we inhabit the world that they created. And there are ongoing consequences of those sins and policies and decisions that God is calling us, I believe, to be responsible and to work at repair. And so I think guilt and shame, I'm not a therapist, but it can be, yeah, it can be cathartic in the moment, but I don't think it sustains. So I do think, so to really think about, like, what would substantive, like real, and again, energetic work that really does build a critical mass in terms of what we can do to make things better, what we can do to help repair this broken world that God has called us to help, like, fix. I think that can be, again, not easy work. That is hard work. But I think that can energize, and I think that could be, like, positive. But yeah, that's just when you were talking. That's what I thought of. Do you want to help break down shame and guilt?
Yeah. No, you teed me up perfectly there. No. No, and I think it is important, right? Because I think some of why we run away from a lot of these things is related to, one, even our conceptualizations of the two of them, right? And so lots of times we use shame and guilt interchangeably, but they're not the same, right? So again, I always say it again, guilt is recognizing that I did something wrong. Maybe I benefited from something wrong, right? But I'm still keeping my full identity as a person. Shame is defining myself by this thing, right? So guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. Guilt is I messed up. Shame is I am messed up, right? And they're two different things. But I think it's important to separate the two because often we use terms like white guilt and everything else like that. But I often say that we're a country, and I get to add Christian on to in this space, right? Like, I don't think we're a country of white Christian guilt. I think we're a country of white Christian shame, right? Because with guilt, I can recognize a wrong, take some responsibility, and figure out how do I try to make something right. But with shame, I do any combination of four things. I avoid, I attack myself, I attack others, or I withdraw, right? And if we think about the way we've approached racism and tackling poverty in our world, what we've typically done is we avoid it. Don't bring that up. Yeah, I love when I was listening to you talk the doctrine, and I was like, man, this is well done, right? Avoid, right? Attack myself. You know, I'll hear people when they start hearing the true history of this country, well, man, it makes me ashamed to be white. That's not the goal, right? You know, that's not the goal. You know, attack others. Well, those of you who bring this up, you know, you're the troublemakers. You're being divisive, right? You're causing the harm, as if telling somebody about the bad thing that happened was the problem. It's kind of like the kid who was abused by the uncle, bringing it up at the family reunion. Well, now you've divided the family. I'm sorry. I thought my uncle did that when he was harming me.
Or the doctor who gives the diagnosis.
Yes, exactly, right, yes. Yeah, we don't want to hear those two things, right? Or we withdraw, disconnect completely. I'm colorblind, right? And again, we were taught, in the 80s, that's what we were taught we're supposed to go towards, right? But again, I think about this. My daughter's 9 now. When she was 2, 3, and 4, she was learning all her colors. So you telling me at 24, 34, 64, she's not going to see her colors anymore? The issue was never seeing color. The issue was ranking people's value based on that. It is okay to see the difference in melanin in all of us out here, as long as we don't then say, you're a better person because of yours, you're a better person because of yours, right? And so going back to this place, you know, I think that's why I said we have to move from shame briefly into guilt and then into the compassion and accountability, right? To me, that's the path. I think we've been stuck in the shame place, and what's happening with ICE and everything else like that. These are shame-based activities, right? We took out Martin Luther King because he was too honest, not only about the racial part, but the economic part. He was saying, oh, that's how ashamed we truly are as Americans. Like, if you're really proud to be an American, then you're proud to acknowledge, here's the full truth, good, bad, and ugly. My wife has been married to me now for 16 years. She's known me since 2nd grade. She knows me good, bad, and ugly, and yet still made this decision, right? Like, that's what actual love is. It's not just simply saying, hey, this is the good part of me. Well, we're only going to talk about the good part. That's fetishizing.
And Justin, you maybe think, William Sloane Coffin said that there were 3 types of patriots. There's the uncritical lover, the loveless critic, and then there's those that carry on a lover's quarrel with their nation. And I think he said something to the effect of, like God's quarrel with the world. But this notion of love being okay to engage in tough things, right? And so that's what we've tried to do today, right? And before we wrap up, were there any other questions? I have one last one that I hadn't got to yet, but want to make sure. Okay, then, but this one, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase it a bit, talking about responsibility to future generations. This person wrote grandkids, but responsibility to future generations. Each of you works in those spheres, right? Whether it's students or patients or children or those that we work alongside of. And so what do you see, and you're all also connected to the Church Big C, right? We have a little interdenominational life going on up here, but the Church Big C, what do you see as the church's responsibility in this sphere, right? Both all three, the awareness, relationship, and commitment. And what does it look like to take that seriously with an eye towards kids will be growing up and in 20 years asked if they're colorblind, right?
The previous question asked about cemeteries, and I think that links in a certain way because we have found that either out of some type of theological necessity or geographic necessity that we have to bury the dead. And I think that there's a lot to consider there, and what's coming to mind most is the sacredness of the land that we are on. I think that what we can give to future generations is to think about how this land is to be used, what is God's role in it, what is our role in it. So like what you're doing here at Newell, you have lots of land in a city that is growing, and its land is being commodified as valuable, and you're seeing that there is a need to use the land for greater good, in a sense of like loving your neighbor. And I think that church probably needs to see itself as not only the body of Christ, which is obviously very theological and very important, but also as a building and space and land, and how we can use all of this space and building for the future.
I think several years ago, I went to Seoul, South Korea, with a group of Columbia students, and we stayed at the Presbyterian University and Theological Seminary in Seoul, and I met the church historian there, Kyung-So An, and he was saying, sometimes he's invited in to speak to Presbyterian churches in Seoul and the area, and he's this renowned church historian and the like, and they were looking to him for a lot of advice and stuff, and he told the students and I, one thing I tell them, particularly if it's an older, seasoned congregation, he asks, are you happy and comfortable with everything that is happening at your church? Like, do you like everything? And then when they say yes, he says, I tell them, your church is going to last 5 more years. And he says, and then he gets to the more serious point he told us, like the measure of like a church's faithfulness is that, and again, I don't mean to pick on older folks. He was actually picking on older folks, I will say, but like him. But it is that, and I guess that's the church's responsibility. How willing are those of us who are comfortable, those of us who have been in the churches for a while? And I'm getting there. I'm making the turn to how willing are we to be uncomfortable? How willing are we to be unsettled? How open are we? Not doing new things for newness' sake. I don't think that's, for example, the Presbyterian thing, and I don't think that's what Semper Reformanda, always being reformed, means. But I think with carefulness and creativity, how open are we to change and to difference for future generations? If you are, maybe, I'm channeling Dr. An from Korea, if you are totally happy in your church and totally comfortable, maybe something's wrong. And maybe that's something that future generations will not help them. I don't know, but that's what I thought of.
At the risk of taking a text and starting to preach a sermon here, I think of Philippians 2, the Christ hymn that Paul quotes, that Jesus did not think of equality with God as something to be grasped, something to be held onto, but rather, taking on the form of a slave, he emptied himself. Theologians use the fancy word kenosis, self-emptying. And I just think that all of our sins, especially our material sins, go back to trying to hold on to things too tightly. And that the best legacy that we can leave is just to give it away. Our power, our privilege, not in naive ways, not in foolish ways, but in ways that create the common good, maybe is the simplest way to say that.
I think part of what's refreshing about a campus environment is that students are coming in not because they have to, not because their parents are looking over their shoulder, but because they want to be in those spaces, and I think have a hunger for authenticity that the church is, among other institutions, uniquely poised to offer. So rather than sort of looking towards these trends, do we get a PowerPoint, do we get a contemporary worship service, or whatever it may be, things that can be valuable in their own right in certain spaces. the church can lean into its capacity to be an authentic institution that is honest holistically, and invites people to be their full, honest selves. There's not a lot of room for that in a world that's pushing performance, I would say, and students are certainly in spaces that expect high performance and are looking towards uncertain futures. So seek to live with authenticity.
Kind of following that, I guess I would say the thing we can give them is space. Now, one, obviously, space to participate, space to be open and honest with us, space to make mistakes and realize that a mistake doesn't have to be life-ending, right? Unless it is literally a life-ending mistake, we don't need to treat it like that. You know, I think that our young people are under ridiculous amounts of pressure that we do not acknowledge. Like we talk about the coddling, but we don't talk about the rat race that a lot of our kids live in. I think that we can model, the space of being able to work through mistakes ourselves by acknowledging our own, right? Like acknowledge the fact that, again, for whatever strides we're making to be more inclusive now, at other points in my life, I was on the wrong side of things. I've been a part of homophobia if you found me in 6th grade, right? I'm working now, I've been working the last however many years to atone through supporting folks and participating differently and recognizing that Christianity does not have to push people out of the doors. And so to me, I think that what we can give young people is space, one, for their voices, but also space to see that we can continue growing, and basically until we are put in the ground or however you go about doing things, that again, the opportunity for growth remains.
Well, I want to say, speaking of space, that I'm so grateful to have gotten to share some with y'all, right? One of the things that I love so much about my job, I'm not sure why it's a job, but I get to just spend time with awesome people. And the fact that hosting a lunch and learn just means calling some friends and saying, can we talk in front of some other people for a bit? And so I'm grateful to all of y'all for giving up your time and your passions and your voice, as we together pursue this notion of a beloved community, to paraphrase Langston Hughes, that never has been and yet must be, right? And so I think that is what we're after together. And so let's give them a round of applause. And I don't think I'd be doing my job as a pastor if I didn't close us in prayer. And so before I do, there is some material at the back that you're welcome to get a hold of, talk to any of these folks. You are invited. It's not compulsory, obviously, though, could argue maybe it is, that we're going to have a happy hour at the Armored Cow Brewing Company just down the street. It's the closest brewery to here. It's about 5 minutes away. And so if you want to do more of a meet and greet, at least the Reverend Dr. William Yu will be there. I'm not sure if anybody else is able to make it. But speaking of him being there, he will be here in this pulpit tomorrow morning. I would not be pushing for you to necessarily come and listen to me on a Sunday morning, but I'm getting to do it on behalf of someone else. I am here about 50 of the other Sundays a year. So, but William will be preaching here at Newell in the morning, and so we would welcome and love to have any of you join. And we live stream that as well, just the exact same way we did this. But with that, I'll close us in prayer, and I'm big on, if I didn't write it, I'm going to tell you who did. You heard me reference William Sloane Coffin. This is a prayer of his, so I'm going to offer it as we prepare to go out. Because we love the world, O Lord, we pray now for the grace to quarrel with it, to quarrel with the worship of success and power, to quarrel with all that profanes and trivializes people and separates them. Number us in the ranks of those who went forth from this place longing only for those things for which you make us long, those for whom the complexity of the issues only served to renew their zeal to deal with them, those who alleviated pain by sharing it, and those who were always willing to risk something big for something good, because the world is too dangerous for anything but truth and too small for anything but love. So may it be so this day and always. Amen. Thank you all for coming out.